air. And now, okay, so the recording has been started.
Thank you so much, Nimadi.
Oh,
Okay. Good evening, everyone. The Department of English, Surendranath College, in collaboration with the IQAC, presents the second extended lecture of this year. This evening, we are delighted to have with us Shaswat Panda, Assistant Professor at the Department of English, MSCB University, Orissa. He is a PhD scholar at the Department of English, Delhi University. And I must add that it has been my privilege to have worked with him at the English Department of Lakshmi Bai College, Delhi University. With that, I would invite our esteemed speaker to begin his lecture, please.
Thank you so much, Shairi, and thank you, Surendranath College, for giving me this opportunity to speak on the subject with which I'll be making my presentation shortly. Thank you to the audience, to listeners who have joined in spite of the fact that this isn't particularly a very pleasant time to participate in any form in these kind of events. So I'm grateful to everyone. Thank you so much. I'll start with my presentation. I hope my screen is visible. I'll be sharing a few slides. So this presentation is titled Copyright, Authorship and Literature in 18th Century England. What I intend to do in my presentation today is to connect these words that are there in the title of the presentation and see how these impinge upon one another. My broad aim is to develop an understanding of literature which goes beyond the usual question of texts, authors, or other formal elements that we can think of. So I have a few concerns here. My objectives are one I have just mentioned. My second objective is to trace the material histories of literature via law, publishing practices, to look at a wide literary culture of the 18th century by looking at texts, authors, publishers, readers, and networks through which texts are produced, circulated, and consumed. This is a field or this is an area of study which has been there for quite some time, and cultural historians of the 18th century, or even literary historians or book history scholars, have tried to explore this field. So, of course, the work that I am discussing today draws on the scholarship of various scholars working in all these fields that I've just mentioned. And then we will devote some time to understand a few things about copyright, to just to be clear about a few things, to get a few things out of our way, things that are usually said about copyright, but which may not be sometimes technically correct, or do not adequately explain what exactly copyright is. So in fact, what I have planned to do is I'll start with copyright, and I'll look at important moments in the history of copyright in 18th century England. And my emphasis is to show how certain definitions, certain ideas, or more broadly, certain discourses of literature in the 18th century were formed around this very important legal term, copyright. Although it's not just legal, I would like to make it clear at the beginning. Why 18th century England? For several reasons. Now, 18th century is the period when there's a publishing boom. A lot of books, tracts, etc. are published. There's a market. All kinds of works were getting published. We get to witness fascinating debates around literature on questions of originality, imitation, hack writing, the Grub Street culture that some of us might already be familiar with. Also the idea of so-called high literary culture and low literary culture. We have seen several writers write about it, talk about it. Alexander Pope, most notably, derided, spoke very denigratingly of this so-called low literary culture, known for hack writers of the Grub Street. We will also look at some of the legal and political entanglements of literature. Of course, we will look at copyright, very importantly, piracy, censorship, and licensing issue. We look at how the author or the figure of the author emerges in the 18th century as a socially distinct figure. Uh, we look at some of the conceptual debates of this period, particularly by looking at the work or by looking at work of literature as property, how literature is thought of as property. And then we look at the importance of readers, because this is the time there is a lot, there's widespread proliferation of print, but of course there was print before as well. But the publishing industry really mushrooms around this time, and then there are also readers who become important for these publishers, because of course who would read unless um, there are readers. And we see that in the later part of the 18th century there are a lot of writings which are on reading, actually, which tell the reader or try to instruct the reader how to read a text, what are the ways, what's the utility, etc., etc. And then we try and understand how a certain idea of literature emerges, which is elevated to the status of national culture or national heritage. Because when the 18th century, in the opening part of the 18th century, that there are people who are very skeptical about what literature has become around the first or second decade, because some people think that literature is nothing but just a commercial activity, money making stuff. So what is it worth after all? But we see how slowly, ironically, it's because of this of this money making business, this commerce or whatever we may call it, that eventually literature becomes a part of this national culture of England, which is a very important project for England in the 18th century. So let me now start with the first major idea that I'm interested in, which is copyright. Right? All of us have seen this. If you can see on your screen, there is this sign of C, which is encircled, and we have seen this in books, etc. This notorious C, copyright, very serious matter. And there's a text box which appears here, and this we usually find in the half title page of books, which says no part of this book may be reproduced or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic or mechanical, including photocopying, our good old friend, and recording, or in any information storage or retrieval system without prior written permission of whoever it is. Now, this is a very common thing that you find in several books in our times. And I have shared this just to remind us that the way the science of copyright, as it were. So what exactly is copyright? Let me first make it clear that copyright is unfortunately not the right to copy, very strictly speaking. So the definition of copyright, as the Oxford English Dictionary provides us, is, and I quote, if a person or organization holds the copyright on a piece of writing, music, etc., they're the only people who have the legal right to publish, broadcast, perform, etc., and other people must ask their permission to use it or any part of it, close quotes. A couple of important things here, that this definition of copyright that we find in the Oxford English Dictionary takes into account the various media in which something can be reproduced, which is why the question of performance and broadcast. And then that the whole text or the whole entity or even a part of it is not allowed for reproduction. But what we are looking at, the period that we are looking at, there around that time, the debates of copyright was mostly pertaining to printed stuff. Uh, Books, texts, tracts, whatever were printed, and how they were subject to strong copyrights. And then again, let us just be clear about a few things, get rid of the misconceptions. Copyright is not just a question of rights of individual. It could be shared with organizations. Copyright is not simply a legal, or it is technical, it is legal matter, but that's not what it is exclusively, uh, or without any repercussion on questions of creativity, etc. Or that it is relatively new. When we think of copyright, we might be mistaken into thinking that, oh, this must be something which has happened in the last 100, 200 years, but no, that's not really the case. And we'll see it goes way back in time. Or that we think parts can be copied, whole cannot be. That will not be true. Even parts cannot be copied in so many cases. There are lot of factors on which these questions are contingent upon. For today's purpose, I shall look at four major historical junctures. 1662, the Licensing of the Press Act. Then right after Restoration, Charles II comes to power. We usually identify this period as something where a lot of activity happens, and perhaps everybody was very tensed, and the Puritans had deprived England of all joys, and Charles II comes back, theatre flourishes, etc. But that is a different story. There are stringent laws which are put in place, namely through this Licensing of the Press Act. I'll talk about it very quickly, but let me just first outline what I want to do, what I want to say about history of copyright in England. 1695, this Licensing Act lapses. Then 15 years later in 1710, which again is a very, very crucial moment in the history of copyright, which is when this Statute of Anne, or the Act for Encouragement of Learning, is introduced. And then we look at a very important moment in the history of copyright debates and controversies, which is 1774. This quarrel, fight, case, whatever you want to call it, between two publishers, one Scottish, one London-based, Donaldson versus Beckett. And this then marks the end of perpetual copyright. So let us start with the 1662 Licensing of the Press Act. Now, this act was very stringent, as I have said. Now, what it did, that it introduced the idea of preprint censorship, that whatever, say, if I want to publish a book, I will first have to submit my manuscript, and submit it to whom? To this guild of London-based printers and booksellers called the Stationers' Company. Please forgive me, there's a bit of an error in the first sentence. Kindly overlook that. And the Stationers' Company was not something which just took birth in the 17th century. It had been there long before that. They were very powerful group of people when it came to publishing, at least. So you had to leave a copy with them, and then they would decide over the fate of your book, mostly concentrated in London. And look at the provision of the act, what it says, quote, an act for preventing the frequent abuses in printing seditious, treasonable, and unlicensed books and pamphlets, for regulating of printing and printing presses. The keywords being seditious, treasonable, that lest somebody should write something against the monarch, because as you know, the restoration, the monarchy was restored after years of civil war and political unrest. So there were fears that people might just be writing against the king. So one idea was to put a check on that. Treasonable, the word, of course, is very strong. Then The other targets were so-called blasphemous writings which targeted religion, because the 17th century, as you know, there were a lot of debates around religion, and then libelous works that would go to the level of personal attack, as some would see it. Now, some of you might know that there was, as it were, a genre of writing uh, which I mean, it wasn't exactly called libel or anything, but the kind of writing it was that would tantamount to libel, where people would indulge in slanders, personal remarks, etc. So there was a kind of writing called scandal sheets. So where there would be writers writing about famous people, about their personal lives, etc. So this mechanism was introduced to put a check on that. Interestingly, sequels, translations, and abridged editions of texts did not fall under its ambit. So nothing on that. Now, these are very interesting points to observe, that what exactly counts as literature when we look at the history of the Copyright Act. Now, what escapes, what is included, what is excluded. So that tells you something about what is taken seriously or what is overlooked. Then between 1679 and 1685, the provisions of this act were suspended. There were constant opposition, and it was struck down in 1695. One of the major intellectuals, writers of the times who opposed the licensing of the Press Act was none other than the philosopher John Locke. And Locke's argument was simple. He said that law had no business coming between books and the public. Now, very important to note that Locke and several others who followed Locke argued for freedom, or freedom from such so-called draconian laws, in the name of public interest. That knowledge, for example, must be made available to public without any hindrance. But there was a personal angle to this as well, which is that Locke wanted to publish an edition of Aesop's fable. But according to the provisions of this laws, everything had to undergo the scrutiny of the stationer's company, and they refused to publish it. And several works of classics shared a similar fate. But when it was finally struck down in 1695, what it at least achieved was that it allowed more freedom to the press. At least you didn't have to submit your manuscript. This idea of preprint censorship, that that came to an end. And because there was greater freedom to press, it also saw the rise of journalism, the rise of journalistic writings, in particular. Two significant figures from the period, Daniel Defoe and Jonathan Swift, they started their career as journalists, and they were the ones who benefited from this process. Now, both these writers, incidentally, were also involved with the next important act, which is the Statute of Anne, or the Act for Encouragement of Learning, which was passed in 1710. On the left of the screen is a copy of the text, what it says. And very quickly, the association of Swift and Defoe with the passage of this act is that there are some who believe that the drafting of this act, the invisible hand behind the drafting of this act, is that of Defoe's, and some say that of Swift's. So not much clarity on that, but at any rate, Defoe was closely associated with some of these booksellers. What happened between 1695 and 1710? The booksellers were a bit worried as to what was going to happen. Who were these booksellers? The booksellers are not the booksellers that you and I know, not people who are simply selling books at a shop or counter or something. Booksellers in 18th century meant more than that. They were also publishers. What the booksellers wanted in this act, it was not so much to do with this preprint censorship stuff. It was to do with the idea of perpetual copyright over the works, because after the guild or the stationers company's role or hold over this entire affair became weak, the booksellers became important. They are the ones who would have the rights to this works, and so they thought that if they had the right throughout their lifetime, then of course they would have a say in all matters, and they would be powerful, simply put. What they did, they said that copyright. They cast the entire argument using the idea of property. They said that literature is a precious property. It should not be just thrown open. Anybody would publish any random thing. They would not handle it properly, and so therefore caution must be exercised. That was their argument. What they did, technically speaking, now this law, the 1710 Statute of One, was actually a statutory law. It was introduced then. But what they wanted, the booksellers, that this should become a part of the common law, which means that violation of the law would be treated with strict action, punishment, just as, let's say, a crime, the action against some kind of crime would be taken. So if, for example, there is a case of piracy would be equated with theft, and you could be put behind the bars. But the booksellers were at the same time apprehensive of other things, apprehensive of their arguments being dismissed or not succeeding, or other repercussions affecting their commercial interests. So they didn't push it too far. But what this act achieved was that it put an end, or rather, for at least for some years, for several years actually, the idea of perpetual copyright was no longer valid. It said that copyright could be would be restricted to 14 years for new works. If the author was still alive after 14 years, it would be extendable to another 14 years, making it 28 years. Works that were already in circulation, had already been printed and published, those works, the copyright on those works would last for 21 years. Now, why is this act important? It is important because, as I've just said, very obviously, that it's put a check on this idea of perpetual copyright. So that's how it was important, and this already the preprint censorship idea was done away with. But then there were two issues. One, this idea of literature as property was not clearly settled. There was still lack of clarity. What a kind of property was literature? Tangible property, intangible property. If it is property, would it become, would then copyright fall under common law, or would it still be a matter of just a statute? So there was doubt on that. There was lack of clarity over that. The other problem was, even though the arguments on ending perpetual copyright were advanced in the name of the authors, in the interest of the authors, effectively the booksellers continued to benefit out of this process, because the authors would have to go to the booksellers to get it published. And if they would publish, and many of them would not publish your work unless they extracted their pound of flesh, as they say. So these authors were practically at their mercy. So they controlled it. That was very, very important. But this work also did something, this act, that it required the bookseller to submit 9 copies at different institutions. But what is important to note here, what this act did, and this is why I said that we need to look at certain material histories of literature, not only in terms of texts and authors or periods and trends. There were contestations and debates around the idea of literature and property. And the very idea of property itself underwent change for a very important reason, that if you look at the late 17th century, around the time of Locke, etc., property was still conceived, it was thought of in the idea of that, what should we say, land economy, landed class, etc., and their idea of property, fixed, immovable, and so on, land, very simply put. Later, in the 18th century, with the middle of the 18th century, particularly, see there are many proponents and advocates of market economy, of trade, etc. And their idea was that property is something that could exchange hands. With the emergence of market economy, as John Pocock has written about in his book, property was seen as something which is movable, exchangeable, etc., etc. And it is within these debates that we need to define or understand literature. On the one hand, static, look at the material object in which literature is present, and the other is literature, or the idea of literature in terms of ideas, thoughts, expression, or something abstract to it. In abstract, not in the sense of that which is not understood really, but not necessarily having a clear material manifestation. So what happened was, with the passage of this act, the fallouts, as I have said, that copyright became a statute-dependent privilege, as Trevor Ross calls it. Authors were identified as proprietors, and there was an emphasis. A lot of people wanted to bring literary works under common law, and they often said that, well, piracy is a major problem, and unless you bring it under the common law, you can't check piracy. The punishment had to be strict. And then booksellers, they wanted to use this ambiguity to their advantage, and they also received the backing of important people. For example, the very important legal authority, William Blackstone, who wrote on the British institutions of law. I have quoted him here, and look at the words again. Quote, "Whatever method the author takes of conveying the composition to the ear or eye of another, by recital, by writing, or by printing, in any number of copies or at any period of time, it is always the identical work of the author which is so conveyed, and no other man can have a right to convey it, transfer it without the author's consent." Now, the idea very obviously is that it takes literature to the realm of ideas, that it has almost like, let's say, Plato, that it originates in the mind, and that the idea belongs to that person. You can't be, you have no business copying it, right? And look at ear, eye, etc. So going beyond writing and print, for example. Right? And because of people like Blackstone, this idea of literature, or this idea of copyright, came to be thought of as intellectual property, something that belongs to one's mind. You can guess. Then another major breakthrough is the 1774 famous case, Donaldson versus Beckett, matter that was taken to the House of Lords. And what was the controversy around? The controversy was around a text that was actually published several years ago in 1726, a famous canonical text which students of literature are familiar with, which is James Thomson's The Season, 1726. And then Donaldson, who was a Scottish, now very quickly, it was very important. One interesting thing that we noticed with while studying this history of copyright, or in general publishing history, is that there is very often a debate on the one hand, or let's say not really debate, but quarrel or rivalry, whatever you want to call it, competition, to use a sober expression, between these London-based publishers and then the Scottish publisher. And it was a long-drawn battle which went on even after this lapse of perpetual copyright. Now, Scotland, as many of you would know, had become an important center for publishing. London already was, but Scotland too, because as you know, the Enlightenment had a deep impact, a profound impact on Scotland. So many thinkers, philosophers were published and were products of the Scottish Enlightenment, and the publishing industry too expanded. And some of the major publishing houses that we know were from Scotland, were of Scottish origin. I mean, think of like a Macmillan or a John Murray and Scottish origin. But be that as it may, in the 18th century, we often find this quarrel between the London booksellers and the Scottish ones. Yes, so the controversy that we were talking about regarding the publication of James Thomson's The Season was because this Scottish publisher, Alexander Donaldson, had published one edition, and then he was being sued. I mean, not exactly sued, but yeah, certainly he ran into trouble with this London-based publisher, Thomas Beckett, who thought that this was an infringement of copyright because Beckett had originally published the work in 1726. And that's where this begins. But there's a little bit of a prelude to this controversy. In 1769, there was another controversy case between two firms, and famously the Miller versus Taylor case. And what it did was it was a divided verdict between the members of the King's bench, and there were members who fought against perpetual copyright, and then there were among them those who were a bit conservative minded in these matters, who said no, perpetual copyright must stay intact, and eventually the ones who wanted perpetual copyright to stay succeeded. So in a way, this pushed that matter further, and what happened was those who were fighting perpetual copyright, they won. And look at one of the individuals who spoke while this case went on in February of 1774, Lord Camden. Quote, authors are entrusted by Providence with the delegated power of imparting to their fellow creatures that instruction which heaven meant for universal benefit, close quotes. Very important in this argument is that of course, one that was already there, we have seen some of it before, that the idea of advancement of knowledge is important, but you can't stop knowledge. You shouldn't stop knowledge from being circulated, from being disseminated. But look at how it defines the author's role. It says that Providence has given the power of creativity to author. And why is that? So that mankind may benefit from it, that their job therefore is to serve people, is to disseminate knowledge. So it gives certain importance to readers, right? And it's not just a deduction that I'm making simply by reading this sentence. Readers had actually become important around this time. Now, of course, one is also aware by making a statement of this kind that the readership of 18th century England was not what it would become in the 20th century, or that everywhere people were reading, but nevertheless, there were important changes which had happened. So what we glean from the passage of this act is that that the author is seen as somebody who's meant to serve the common reader. And yes, because the idea of perennial copyright came to an end, what it then made possible was for editions, multiple editions of canonical works to be published. So if copyright no longer existed, you could publish those works, and especially of authors of distant past. So around this time, that is in this decade of the 18th century, we also witness prolific circulation, wide-scale publication of works, particularly poetry of Milton, works of Shakespeare, for example. Things were made possible because this act was passed. And that what that actually did, because this was possible, this was made possible, the passage of this act, the process of building a canon of English literature was made possible, which may not have been possible had the idea of perennial copyright existed for long. I have talked about copyright, looking at some of the important moments in the history of copyright debate. And England, in fact, was the first country where copyright was taken seriously, and you had this clear, meticulous legislations being made. So I've talked about copyright, and I have talked a bit about literature, of how certain ideas of literature emerged as a consequence of these copyright battles. Now I want to concentrate on the other part of my talk, which is author. So who exactly in the 18th century was thought of as an author, or what was meant by authorship? Some of you might have read this essay by the French historian Michel Foucault called "What is an Author?" This is instead of "Who is an Author?" And what he tried to do in that essay is to look at author as in terms of author function. Foucault says that authorship marks a certain privileged moment of individualization in the history of ideas, quote unquote. Who were these authors in 18th century? Now, very importantly, in the 18th century, the author occupies a very important role, not because they thought that it was in this century that great writers were produced and they did not exist before, no, not because of that. What I'm trying to say is that the author is a very distinctly identifiable individual. And that the author and the persona of the author is also very important. The stories around authors, and very often you will find so many authors who are who have had to live in penury for several years, who would have to struggle. And why would they struggle? Because they wanted to make a living out of writing, because writing had become a professional activity, and of course not without considerable risks. First of all, there was no assurance that you ventured into it, you forayed into it, and then you would make a lot of money. There were other risks. You could be sued, could be tried if you wrote risky things. So there was that. Then, of course, problems of what you are writing, how could you make money, whether it would sell or not. So many of them would be dependent on patrons. Who would be patrons? These rich, learned aristocrats who would patronize your work, which means that they will say, fine, you write this and I'm going to sponsor it, I'll pay you. Then there was something called subscription. So there were subscribers. So let's say I write something, and then there are a few who will pay and buy copies of my work, limited circulation again. And also that I had to be assured of a few people who would certainly buy my work. Then there was the question of market, which becomes a very important force from the later half of the 18th century, once this institution of patronage seems to weaken, or that once patrons weren't all too willing to support your work, you were dependent on the market. Simply that you wrote something out in the market. If people bought your book, you made money. Otherwise, you couldn't. So you were dependent on bookseller. You were also dependent on readers, who ultimately would buy your book, the readers. And as I've just said, booksellers too, in their own sweet ways, they continued exploiting the authors. You also have a very different idea of author, apart from these poor, miserable fellows who were struggling in London, usually because that was the publishing hub. The idea of author as genius, as somebody who's gifted, who has exceptional talents that others do not have. Now, this is an idea of author that we often associate with the Romantics, but that idea was prevalent in the later part of the 18th century as well. For example, Edward Young wrote extensively about who was a genius. Authors were thought of as genius, exceptional people, talented, etc., etc. Mark Rose has written a very important essay on authorship in England, where he calls authors proprietors. And what he does is he situates this idea of authorship in before and after the lapse of the Copyright Act and how authors became prominent after that. So, like I said, when we look at the idea of author in 18th century, we have to keep in mind there's several factors. On the one hand, authors and their struggles, and authors are those who were endowed with certain gifts of the mind. But it was not easy being an author. Would like to quickly show a sketch, a painting actually, by the famous painter William Hogarth, which is called The Distressed Poet. Now, the reason I have used this is that it gives you some idea about what authors were doing in the 18th century. Now, here, this was apparently based on the author that appears, the poet that appears in this painting is inspired by Pope. As you can see, the poet is lost in his thoughts, staring out of the window, giving a faraway look. And the room doesn't particularly look tidy and organized. Everything is scattered. Certain signs of poverty. The lady sitting on the chair is the poet's wife, having to deal with everyday business. There's some transaction being carried out with somebody who's come to the door. There's a little cat who's curled up on some crumpled sheet. Things are lying here and there. So this was supposed to also mock the author who is concerned with his otherworldly pursuit while his family suffers. So this gives you an idea of authorship in 18th century England, that those who were dealing with a lot of things, and also that they were a bit selfish in neglecting these other aspects of their lives. Now, this is the last part of my talk, where I specifically focus on Samuel Johnson. And the reason is that Johnson, the case of Johnson, as I have mentioned here, the career of Johnson gives us a vivid account of 18th century literary culture. And it tells us the story from various perspectives. Now, Johnson had an interesting career, fascinating actually, because the kind of developments that happen in the 18th century literary culture, we get some idea of those developments by looking at Johnson's career. Johnson was born in 1709 in Lichfield, son of a bookseller. And he, again, was a struggling writer who came to London after his brief stint as a teacher. And he came to London in the hope that he would make a living, to eke a living out of writing. And he came, he was a part of the, he was learned. He knew Latin, for example, really well, but he had to struggle. So he was a part of that Grub Street, and he befriended a man when he was a part of that Grub Street culture called Richard Savage. Now, Savage was, and the views on Savage are divided. Some think of it as the unacknowledged genius of the 18th century, very unusual, but Savage, there's also some element of notoriety associated with him, criminal, etc. And Johnson wrote a Life of Savage, and the Life of Savage gives us some idea about the world of the Grub Street writer, who could be a talented person, but who had other problems. But that's a different story. Johnson started his career working with Edward Cave, who ran this magazine called Gentleman's Magazine, like several people ran several other magazines. What he did when he worked for him, he wasn't meant to produce anything original, quote unquote, but to produce reports, reports of parliamentary debates, of wars, of people traveling to distant places, etc., etc. Now, when Johnson began, he too wrote as an anonymous author. Now, anonymity was a common phenomenon in those days, and there are people who have written extensively on this fascinating subject of anonymity in 18th century. John Mullen, Michael Mackian, you could refer to their works. And Johnson slowly but surely evolved as a writer. And at one point in his career, when he was meant to compile an English dictionary, he was denied patronage by the Earl of Chesterfield. And Johnson was very upset that his patron turned out to be so stingy and parsimonious. And then he was helped by these booksellers, and he produced the dictionary eventually. It was a long project. But because he had seen that world of struggling writers, of booksellers from close quarters, he largely remained sympathetic to the cause of the booksellers. But interestingly, at one point in his career, certainly after a certain point, he also wrote repeatedly of the common reader. That was the expression, common reader, that the reader is not somebody you can dismiss or overlook, that the readers are the ultimate judges of taste, good, bad literature, etc. Now, with Johnson, what is also important is that if you look at his career and his engagement with copyright, it's very fascinating. For example, while he was working with Cave, he apparently ran afoul of copyright law and they had to face certain problems. As he became a writer, his own writings were plagiarized. So, for example, he wrote this short novella called Rasselas, the Prince of Abyssinia. That is supposed to have been plagiarized, or the writings that he wrote for The Idler or The Rambler, some of those. So he himself had a tryst with copyright. He was a victim of copyright violation. And what is important to my mind when we look at the career of Johnson is his views on copyright, the way his views evolved. Now, I have just highlighted three important junctures here. 1763, he says that, well, copyright should last for 60 years. 2 years later, around the time when Preface to Shakespeare is published, he says, no, it could be extended up to 100 years. 1774, right around the time when this happens, this Beckett Donaldson controversy, in fact, a few days after that, he says that, no, cap it at 50 years. And he writes this letter to William Strahan, an important bookseller, and somebody who played a very important part in Johnson's life in getting his work published, etc. He writes this letter on 7th of March, 1774, which is on your screen, as you can see. He meticulously notes what should be included in copyright, what should not be. So he begins by saying, author has a natural and peculiar right, but then every man who claims the protection of society must purchase it by resigning some part of the right. So the author is not an isolated figure. He must engage with the society. And he says that he should retain, not, mind you, author and not bookseller, no matter what its implications were on the ground. And he says that, no, well, 14 years is fine, going back to 1710. And he said after 14 years it should revert, etc. And look at what he says towards the end. In 50 years, every book begins to require notes either to explain forgotten allusions or obsolete words, or subjoin these dictionaries which have been made by gradual advancement of knowledge, or correct those mistakes which may have been discovered. Such notes cannot be written useful, etc. Now, very important is that he says, well, 50, and then after that, maybe books will be forgotten, will slip into oblivion. And what he has in mind is how books are possibly received after several years. Now, this is his pragmatic side. He might have talked about the purpose of books, the purpose of literature being to please and to instruct. But he also says this, keeping in mind that books will perhaps ultimately be forgotten, and that something must be done to revive their life if they have to survive time. Right? So what Johnson's letter shows, what it tells us is how these debates around copyright were important, how authors were not impervious, they were not indifferent to these debates that were happening, and all. And in course of my talk, I have tried to show how this whole debate of copyright was often made or was often hinged to the question of what can be variously called public, or later readers, or later the reading public. That was very, very important. But there's also something important about Johnson's career, that later when he published his lives of the poets, those biographical accounts were meant to be appended to the works of those poets as prefaces, biographical prefaces. What role did Johnson play there? Johnson was assigned that task, or that the consortium of London-based booksellers requested him because because they perceived what we could say a professional threat from a man called a Scottish bookseller called Bell, John Bell, who had brought out a similar edition. And they thought that if we had to, and that if our work had to survive, do well commercially, we had to frame it within this idea of nationalism. That this is an idea of eminent English poets, not British, as Bell, the work that Bell published, it was British poets, and these were eminent English poets. So we had to couch it in those terms, in an idiom of nationalism, great authors. And Johnson, because he was the most prominent writer of that age, his name would lend credibility to the project. So the point is, I mean, several scholars have said that you have the emergence of authors, and then some have said that you have the emergence of readers. But what we see, that these are not isolated things that were happening. That as the readers emerged, the authors disappeared. It wasn't like that. We need to keep these multiple factors in mind. In fact, what we see is a revival of certain idea of author towards the end of this century. I'll quickly conclude from what I have said. Said, as we have seen, copyright battles of 18th century serve as significant but not exclusive means to understand literary history, canon formation, and changing definitions of literature and authors. Then it also is an important way to understand what literature became in course of 18th century. From being derided as mere commerce, literature came to be celebrated as part of national heritage towards the last quarter of the 18th century. The wide-scale publication and circulation of canonical texts indeed played an important role in making literature a part of this national heritage. And then what did it lead to? What I would like to call unromantic futures. The idea of what the romantic notion of author was, that the author is genius. The author is not something who's a product of the market or something that is at the mercy of readers. Right? And the major proponents of thank you so much for listening.
Shaswat, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. It's just that I think the last two lines were lost because there was some kind of technical glitch. But nonetheless, we definitely enjoyed your talk a lot. And thank you so much for that very, very interesting presentation. And as you can see, our students have not really posted any questions, but I'm sure they have sort of really learned a lot from your presentation. I would still ask our students if there is any kind of questions or any kind of comments that they would like to sort of make on your presentation. But maybe because, I was thinking this is again something
Shairi,
that.
I'm not able to hear you. Have you?
Oh, you
muted
can't hear
your
me?
audio or something?
No. Can you hear me now?
No, I'm afraid I'm still not able to hear you.
Are you able to hear me now? Let me check mine. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Shairi, you are audible. I think he has got some network issues.
Oh, I'm audible. Yeah, Shaswat, because I think.
Can
you hear? Can you hear
if something is wrong at my end? I'm still not able to hear.
Can you hear the other person? Can you hear Madhulina Bauri?
No. Are you able to? If you're able to hear me, could you please post it in the chat box? At least I know I'm audible, because I'm not able to hear you.
Can you hear me? Like
Okay.
Madhulina?
But
no, I think
why
he has got some problem at his end.
Check my audio maybe.
Shairi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I think which is why the last part of the office talk sort of got sort of muted. 1 second. Let me just type. Because he can't hear you either. So
yeah, Shairi, talk to him over phone. Like.
Oh, okay. Yes, I think that's a good idea. So
Hello. Oh. Okay, I think there's a problem with my Zoom because nothing seems to be working at this point. Should I just leave and join back? I mean, otherwise, yeah. Just please give me a minute. Really sorry about this. Yeah.
yeah, so he'll just leave and join in a second because it's just the last 2 minutes of his talk. He's saying that his Zoom screen has frozen or something.
Yeah. Am I
Uh, yes, you're audible. Can you hear me?
okay? Yes, yes. I'm not
Great.
going to switch on my video though. Can you please help me with it?
Yes, yes, that's absolutely fine. So, okay, so basically, thank you so much for that very, very interesting presentation. And I'm sure our students have really, really learned a lot from that. And so basically, Shaswat, I just wanted to ask you something to take us back to, again, the question of syllabus and how we sort of approach the 18th century in our very, still very canonical kind of syllabi that we have, at least here in Calcutta University. And how the 18th century is not really presented to us as a kind of, looking at the material history. Rather, we sort of look at it in terms of, the Enlightenment. And we, of course, because we also have the Spectator series, and you talk very interestingly about literature as part of this creation of a national culture. And then at the same time, you have this kind of a conflict, or rather this very complex arena where both the ideal notions of the poet as some kind of genius is also being undercut, by the idea of the poet as being somewhere confined by certain copyright issues, etc. So I was just wondering, when you teach an undergraduate class, 18th century, how do you really bring sort of something as important as copyright and the creation of a national heritage, and then the very question of the reader and the writer? Because I'm particularly thinking about the Spectator series, because they have that in their syllabus. And it's something that I've always wondered, because, the new middle classes are sort of being presented with a kind of specific kind of pedagogy, specific kind of, idea of entertainment and wit and all of that. So if you could just comment on that, maybe this would also interest our students.
Yes. Thank you, Shadi, for the kind words and for the question. I think scholarship in the last several decades has actually talked about this. I mean, of course, the Spectator marks the beginning of a certain idea of literature, in the sense that that field expands, and what I too try to show in whatever way in my talk is that this category of literature expands in the 18th century. And so I think when we look at these texts, one way of when we approach something like the Spectator, one way is to first of all think beyond the usual forms and genres of literature. And then we have to, I think, understand that literature is not just about texts and their authors. I mean, of course, there is something that is obvious and that is spoken in context of other works of literature as well, that every literary work has a context, a historical context, a socio-economic context, as it were. In this particular case, I think in the 18th century is fascinating because it gives us, I think, an inkling into how this modern notion of literature was shaped. And it was shaped, to my mind, much of that process was outside the traditional canonical field of literature and the authors that we are familiar with. So, of course, now a lot of people talk about the public sphere, etc., while talking about this 18th century periodicals or culture of journalistic writing in the 18th century. But along with that, I think these debates will help us understand why there were, I mean, for example, in lot of writings of 18th century, if we think of important figures like, for example, Swift, or for example, Pope, they do reflect on questions of authorship, of what is good author, what is bad author. Or, for example, in the Spectator in particular, why does the narrator, for example, have to state in very clear terms? Why is he at pains to say what kind of writing they want to do? What is the nature? Why do they have to explain
Exactly.
their position? So I think this reflection, this self-reflexivity is a part of that exercise, because much of that, or many of those writers were actually still trying to come to terms with how this field of literature would be defined. against these political currents, because a lot of controversy around their political allegiances as well, right? Pope said Tories called me Whigs and vice versa and so on. So yeah, so I think, yeah, very, to put it very briefly, the context, I think, is important.
Right. Well, thank you so much again for all your patience and this wonderful presentation. And I just wish our students had been a little more active, but nonetheless, I'm sure we will be sort of also realigning the way we teach this particular century in our classrooms. Very important interventions that were made today. I would like to thank formally Shaswat for giving us his time and for sort of answering to our invitation, and so late in the evening after a whole day's work. Thank you so much, Shaswat, once again.
Thank you, Shairi, and the college and the students. They survived this lecture. That's, I mean, what more could one ask for? So, thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much. So we will be closing this session here. And for the students, I would be circulating the feedback form. So please fill that out for those who are here as soon as you can. And thank you. Good night, everybody. I'm ending the meeting here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shaswat. Madhulina, students, you may leave. Madhulina Di.